If it's Thursday, sources tell NBC News the Biden administration is finalizing plans for an executive action, allowing the president to shut down the southern border as the White House battles a major policy and political problem. Plus, the Supreme Court's conservative majority sides with Republicans in a major redistricting dispute. The court's liberal justices warning it could usher in a new era of racial discrimination against minority voters. And the battle for disillusioned swing state voters who don't like either Joe Biden or Donald Trump. NBC's The Deciders focus group series takes a deep dive into what's driving these all-important double haters heading into November. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, where we're watching both parties and their candidates try to address some of their weakest electoral issues with less than 6 months to Election Day. For Republicans, that issue is abortion. For Democrats, it's the southern border, which is where we begin. Today, Senate Democrats tried to revive that bipartisan border bill that Republicans blocked earlier this year. The effort was destined to fail, but that was arguably the point, as Democrats try to pin some blame on Republicans for the ongoing migrant crisis. Senator James Lankford, who helped craft the bill, dismissing the effort as political, while Minority Leader Mitch McConnell called on President Biden to act right now.
Today is not a bill. Today is a prop. Today is a political messaging exercise.
The solution is a president who's willing to exercise his authority to use the tools he already has at his disposal and to start cleaning up this mess. If Senate Democrats wanted to start fixing the crisis tomorrow, they would be urging the president to do exactly that.
Republicans may get what they're asking for because new exclusive reporting by NBC News reveals the Biden administration is finalizing an executive action that would allow the president to shut down the southern border temporarily. It's one of several executive actions the administration is considering as the Biden campaign looks to close the gap between the president and Mr. Trump on the issue of immigration politically. It comes as a new battleground poll shows voters say they are more worried about President Biden's policy on immigration than Mr. Trump's on abortion. One silver lining for the president, those numbers actually flip when you look at third-party and undecided voters. We talked to some of those battleground voters in Arizona as part of our Deciders Focus Group series. The group consisted of Latino voters who are so-called double haters, frustrated with both candidates. Here's just some of what they had to say.
I feel like they both contributed into not having Washington have any sort of deal in regards to immigration. I feel they both played a part.
Got it. 4 of you blame Biden. The other 4 of you blame Biden. Why?
I chose Biden because it's like you don't hear him speak about the border or try to push for any change or policies in the border. And that's all you would hear about Trump, even though all he would talk about is a wall. But at least that's something.
It just keeps denying that there's anything wrong with the border. Just keeps saying that there's being taken care of,
Okay, got it. And by a show of fingers, who would like to see, if he's reelected to a second term, President Trump finish the wall with Mexico? Who would like to see that? One of you. For the rest of you, why would you want to see the wall completed?
I just don't think it's effective. Like, I mean, a lot of it was already put up, and you see, whether it's Trump or Biden's fault, you still see people coming through. It's expensive. It's been proven to not necessarily help. A lot of people that come in usually fly in, overstay their visa, so it just doesn't make sense to me.
Just fascinating to hear from those voters there. NBC's Julie Sirkin joins me from Capitol Hill. Julie, you were part of the team that broke that exclusive reporting that the Biden administration is thinking about taking some executive actions on the border, as well as our Monica Alba. So let's talk about today's vote. This was a vote about messaging. Do you think it gives the president some cover to start implementing those executive actions?
It certainly does, Kristen. And earlier this month, we actually detailed exactly what the strategy was on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Democrats here wanted another opportunity to show their voters, show their constituents, look, we haven't given up on trying to pass this in the legislative avenue. This is something that both the president and Democratic leadership agree with, that executive action of any kind is only a Band-Aid on a solution, on a problem, rather, that Congress has been unable to tackle for years. But now that they've been able to put this bipartisan bill on the floor again, showing that even the procedural vote had failed, by the way, with a handful of Democrats, progressives, who think the deal went too far in conservatives' direction, they were able to do that. And now, in the Democratic mind, they opened the door for the administration to be able to perhaps act unilaterally, which is some of that reporting that we detailed today.
Well, look, what's notable about this, obviously, is that, as you report, it would allow the president to temporarily shut down the border. That would be a major political flashpoint if he were to actually do that. As you know, it could satisfy those, some moderate, some independent voters. What would it actually look like if he were to shut down the border?
Well, the way that sources describe this to us, Kristen, is that it would be a series of executive actions. And this is something the administration, including some partners here on Capitol Hill, have been talking about for months now, ever since they went into these negotiations back in January and February with the bipartisan group that had failed, that had fallen apart because of former President Trump saying, let's keep this an election year issue. Let's let voters decide this at the ballot box. The administration, seeing what success, a small amount of success that Democrats could have by going on offense with the immigration issue, as you heard from that Decider series, voters really want to see Biden out in front on this. They feel like he hasn't done enough to capitalize on something that Republicans, quite frankly, have owned the territory on for such a long time. Now the administration would use what's known as Section 212F of presidential authority. It would allow the president to direct Border and Customs Patrol agents along the border to essentially pick and choose and to prevent illegal migration between those points of entry, to turn away certain groups of migrants, to keep those numbers low that we've seen so historically high throughout the year, Kristen.
Now, Julie, obviously they would need Mexico's help with this. Mexico has a June 2nd election. How is Mexico responding? Is there a sense that they would help the White House facilitate this?
So this is actually really interesting. We've been talking about how for months they've been working on this strategy. Well, sources tell us that a major flashpoint of this actually came during an April 28th meeting between President Biden and Mexico's president. It was sort of a turning point here that crystallized some of the timing here and why they want to move forward on these executive actions after the June 2nd presidential election in Mexico. The candidate that is handpicked by the current Mexican president, the one that is favored to win, would certainly assume some of these roles that Mexico has to play here. When you turn away migrants at the border, they will remain in Mexico before presumably going back to the countries they came from. So certainly Mexico has a very heavy role to play here, and the administration is keenly aware of that and wants it to continue after the presidential election there.
All right, we know you'll continue to track it. Julie Sirkin, great reporting as always. Thank you for joining us. Now, as we mentioned, Republicans have struggled on the issue of abortion since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and new reporting shows the Trump team recognizes the potential electoral peril they face. Sources tell NBC News that Trump allies are getting involved in the process around the Republican Party's national platform, which has been unchanged since 2016, to prevent a rightward push on issues like abortion. Now it comes as states look to take the issue directly to voters, including in Arizona, where a constitutional amendment would essentially restore access to what it used to be under Roe looks likely to appear on November's ballot. Our Deciders focus group of Arizona voters was largely supportive of the amendment, with 8 of 12 saying they would vote for it. Here's a little bit more of what they had to say.
I mean, I believe a woman has a right to choose. It may not be my personal belief. I wouldn't have an abortion, but I'm not going to take someone else's right away from them.
So, Nicole and Ruben, you would vote no on the constitutional amendment. Do I have that right?
Probably, but I mean, I would agree with previous panelists that said it under special circumstances, but really I'm against the abortion.
I'm on the fence because I understand that the fetus is not viable prior to that, but I also see what my religion teaches about that. I also don't, I feel like, as I said earlier, that the biggest consequence we see is having our rights taken from us, and that's a huge right for women. So I think once we give in to one, it can easily be anything else.
One of the big X factors in this election. Joining me now with more on his fantastic reporting is NBC's Matt Dixon. Matt, thanks so much for joining me. So take me inside your reporting. What are your sources telling you? Why now? Why is the Trump team engaging directly? They didn't try to change the platform in 2020 on this issue.
Sure. Well, there's a couple things. There's timeline and then there's sort of rationale. So the timeline, what the RNC, the Republican National Committee, said at the time in 2020 was that there was some complications over holding a large meeting of the platform committee. And that's the committee that makes these decisions during the height of the pandemic in 2020. So that was their rationale then for not changing the policy platform of the National Republican Party. It was the first time in over 150 years that the platform hadn't been tweaked in a presidential election cycle. So that was the rationale for not addressing any of this stuff in 2020. Let's set that aside. Now the same sort of policy fights over sort of culture war infused issues over same-sex marriage, over abortion, those are some of the issues that weren't dealt with in 2020 that are now being dealt with in 2024. And I think that the Trump campaign getting involved, what our sources are telling us is the idea that they don't want this nasty sort of headline-grabbing political fight over pushing the platform too far to the right. And they're trying to make sure that there's sort of a moderating factor or a mainstream factor going into the general election.
And we've heard former President Trump talk about the potential political pitfalls of the issue of abortion. But given that this has been a part of the party's platform for so long, logistically speaking, how would this work and how much pushback is there?
There is a little bit of pushback among the people we talk to in Republican Party circles. There are some social conservatives, those who have been members of the RNC for a very long time. There was a specific person who said, how are we going to get rid of decades of life language? And life language was the idea of sort of the traditional definition of marriage, sort of anti-abortion, that sort of stuff. So there is generally some slight pushback. But if I were to sort of game this out, it's President Trump and his team that are kind of getting into these very, very obscure and grassroots sort of races that are often don't get very much attention. So more than likely, if you're a candidate who has President Trump or his team's support to try to get on this platform committee, you're probably going to win. So there's a conversation going on, but I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as a civil war or anything of tension that rises too high, because probably Trump's going to get his way as he generally does it in the party.
Well, it's a great point. And just very quickly, Matt, I mean, when you think about the platform versus what Republicans are actually saying and believing, I mean, they're delving into something that has long held orthodoxy for so many conservative voters. The platform will be one thing, but won't necessarily change hearts and minds, right?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think in 2020, the platform wasn't changed. And I think very few sort of on the ground grassroots folks noticed. There was probably some angst among those who are very involved professionally with the party. But by and large, this is sort of an administrative fight. But that being said, this is the platform, the policy platform that the National Republican Party wants to project. So it shouldn't be totally overlooked, but to some extent, I think you're right. The general idea that this has been orthodoxy for decades for the party is kind of well set. I do think there's an attempt to sort of change that, or at least a road around the edges, and that won't necessarily resonate with sort of social conservative Republicans. But I do think this is a nod at try to go to a broader electorate.
All right, Matt Dixon, thank you so much for bringing your fantastic reporting to us. As we've been discussing, both parties and their candidates are making their pitch to voters on both of these critical issues, immigration and abortion. But will it resonate? Or when it comes to the elections, will voters ultimately say, it's the economy, stupid? Joining me now to discuss all of this is Dave Wasserman, senior editor and elections analyst at the Cook Political Report. For more on their swing state project polling. Dave, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kristen.
Let's start with the issue of immigration. As you heard Julie report at the top, the Biden administration is inching closer to potentially passing an executive action that would give the president the authority to shut down the border. That's what Republicans have been calling on him to do. The polling shows more people are worried about his handling of immigration than they are about Trump's handling of abortion. What do you think the impact, though, of these executive actions might be? Would they actually shift voters?
Well, first of all, that's right. 53% of the 4,000 voters that we interviewed in this poll said they were more concerned about Biden potentially handling immigration in a second term than Trump handling abortion. The question is whether it's too little too late for Joe Biden to pivot to the middle on immigration to cover Democrats' weakest issue, much as Trump has tried to pivot to the middle on abortion to hedge against Republicans' weakest issue. And right now, the challenge for Biden is that it's not simply immigration versus abortion. This is a cost of living election.
Oh, so you take me to my next question. The economy is still the top issue, and you have that huge disconnect between some of what we are seeing in the numbers of the economy, the unemployment rate, inflation down from its high point several years ago, and yet so many people all across the country say, we don't feel the impact. We're still paying too much for groceries. Do you think this will be the biggest issue for voters, and what does that foretell for President Biden?
Well, this poll shows far and away it's the top issue for voters. 73% rank it in their top three, and 56% of voters think it's likely that costs come under control under Trump. Just 40% say the same under a second Biden term. And the challenge here for Democrats is twofold. Number one, voters see the economy through the lens of inflation and interest rates more than unemployment, but also they don't see Biden as effective or capable. And the Republicans' argument that stimulus measures made things worse at the outset of Biden's terms, may have resonated a bit. But the number that jumps out to me the most in this poll, Kristen, 66% of voters don't think that Joe Biden will be able to finish a second term, and 64% believe that as a result of that, Kamala Harris will become president at some point during a second Biden term, and 53% say Joe Biden's age and ability to fulfill his duties. That concerns them more than the 47% who say that they're more concerned about Trump's temperament and legal problems. And so I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Biden's decision to run for a second term has severely jeopardized Democrats' ability to beat Donald Trump.
It's one of the intractable issues that he cannot change his age. If you talk to his campaign aides, they say, look, they've got to try to, he's been out of the campaign trail, often trying to make a joke out of it. Let's talk about head-to-head matchup between former President Trump and President Biden. In the swing states and nationally, Trump has a small edge. But boy, things change if you put a third-party candidate into the mix, don't they?
That's right. And in these 7 swing states we polled, Trump was up on balance 47-44 in a two-way matchup. When you throw in third-party candidates, he was ahead by a little bit more, 43-38%. And what we found was that when you really forced those third-party supporters and undecided voters to pick between Trump and Biden, by 40-30%, they picked Biden. So it does appear that on balance, and we're not just talking RFK Jr., but the other third-party candidates, there's Jill Stein, Cornel West, that on balance, they are taking a bit more from Biden than Trump. Now, the upside for Biden here is that if at the end of the day, these voters decide that this is a binary choice between two candidates they don't like, Biden might have slightly more upside with this group, but it's conceivable that many of these people don't vote at all.
Well, and that's the big concern among Democrats. Are people going to stay at home? And that's why the debates are so critical. Could that be a chance for the president to shake up the race or vice versa? We'll have to see what happens. Dave Wasserman, thank you so much for your great analysis. Really appreciate it. And stick with us, actually, because we need your expertise after the break as the U.S. Supreme Court upholds a South Carolina election map that a lower court said exiled the black vote. That's next. And coming up later, we'll hear more from our Double Haters Deciders focus group. Their thoughts on Biden and Trump and what it could mean for independent candidate RFK Jr. You're watching Meet the Press now. Do stay with us. Welcome back. Turning to some major news from the Supreme Court now, as it sided with Republicans today, rejecting a challenge to South Carolina's congressional map that civil rights groups argued unlawfully targeted black voters. The sixth ruling fell along ideological lines, with the conservative majority concluding that those civil rights groups did not do enough to show that Republicans in South Carolina were racially motivated to redraw the district lines. Writing for the majority, Justice Alito acknowledged that predominantly black precincts were moved in a way that diminished their power. But, quote, because of the tight correlation between race and partisan preferences, this fact does little to show that race, not politics, drove the legislature's choice. Justice Elena Kagan, joined by Justices Sotomayor and Jackson, slammed the majority opinion, writing, quote, go right ahead. This court says to states today, go ahead, though you are at best using race as a shortcut to bring about partisan gains to elect more Republicans in one case, more Democrats in another. It will be easy enough to cover your tracks in the end. Joining me now on set is NBC News Supreme Court reporter Lawrence Hurley, and redistricting expert David Wasserman is still here with us. Dave, thank you for sticking around. Lawrence, let me start with you. What are the implications of this opinion, and does it pave the way for potentially similar opinions in the future?
I mean, this is another case from this conservative Supreme Court that makes it harder and harder for civil rights plaintiffs to win these types of cases where they're challenging districts on racial grounds. And of course, this comes after a ruling in 2019 where the court also made it impossible to challenge partisan gerrymandering. So now, as long as a state legislature can say, well, we're just doing this on partisan grounds, which the court says can't be challenged, they can basically do whatever they want. And so these rulings have basically empowered legislatures to do whatever they want.
So you have this ruling. Then just last month, the Supreme Court struck down Louisiana's map. This basically would have reduced the number of majority black districts. These seem to be in conflict.
The difference here is that this case today was based on a constitutional claim of racial gerrymandering, based on the idea that race was predominantly used to draw the districts. The Louisiana case, as well as that ruling a year ago, if you remember, in Alabama, which also struck down Republican-drawn districts, those were based on the Voting Rights Act. And that was a surprising ruling, if you remember, where they actually affirmed the use of the Voting Rights Act to bring these kind of vote dilution claims. And for now, those claims are still good law.
You know, it's interesting because Justice Clarence Thomas took a different approach and basically said the court should not be ruling on these redistricting cases. What do you make of that?
Well, if you remember Justice Thomas last year in the affirmative action case where the court struck down affirmative action in college admissions, he's long embraced this idea of a colorblind constitution where he thinks that, you can't bring any constitutional claims based on race, and because that's not in the Constitution and shouldn't be allowed. So this opinion he wrote today, which no one else joined, he's basically embracing that theory as it relates to any kind of racial gerrymandering claims.
It's just fascinating. Dave Wasserman, let me get your take. Politically speaking, what are the implications for Democrats who are trying to win back the House? Did it just get a little bit harder?
Not really, because this ruling wasn't very much of a surprise. This was always going to be very difficult for the plaintiffs to prove that the lines Republicans passed in South Carolina were purely racially motivated, considering how, the truth is, it's impossible to disentangle race and partisan motivations, considering the correlation between voting patterns and race in the Deep South. But the ruling last summer from the Supreme Court in Alabama was more meaningful for the House and 2024 because it did uphold Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in a way that led to the creation of a new black majority district in Alabama, led to the creation of one in Louisiana that was struck down by a federal panel, but the Supreme Court put a stay on that ruling, so that additional black majority seat is going to remain in effect this November. That net of 2 for Democrats, who are going to be African-American Democrats most likely, will offset the partisan, or at least partially offset the partisan gerrymander Republicans passed in North Carolina, where they obliterated 3 Democratic seats.
In addition to those states, what other states are you going to be watching for as it relates to this issue of redistricting?
Well, for 2024, this was pretty much it, although the Louisiana case that the Supreme Court could hear in the future will determine just how much race can be relied upon. It's a very narrow band of what legislatures can do with regards to race and redistricting, and the Supreme Court and lower federal courts have sometimes appeared to be in tension or conflict on this issue. But those gains in the Deep South for Democrats and civil rights groups are meaningful and impactful for the battle of the House this fall and potentially beyond.
All right, well, we'll watch it all very closely. Thank you so much for helping us break down this complicated issue. Really appreciate it. Lawrence Hurley, Dave Wasserman, great conversation. And still to come, former Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley throws her support behind Donald Trump despite slamming him as unstable and unhinged during the primary. We'll break it down with the panel. That's next. You're watching Meet the Press now.
I think Donald Trump was the right president at the right time. But times change, and so has Trump. He's gotten more unstable and unhinged. He spends more time in courtrooms than he does on the campaign trail. He's so obsessed with his own demons from the past, he can't focus on delivering a future Americans deserve.
Welcome back. That was former Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley on the campaign trail just about 3 months ago. And as has happened with nearly every other Trump opponent in the Republican primary, Haley is now changing her tune. Speaking at a foreign policy event right here in Washington yesterday, Haley said despite the former president's faults on issues she cares about, she will indeed be voting for him in November.
Trump has not been perfect on these policies. I've made that clear many, many times. But Biden has been a catastrophe. So I will be voting for Trump. Trump would be smart to reach out to the millions of people who voted for me and continue to support me and not assume that they're just going to be with him. And I genuinely hope he does that.
Joining me now on set is NBC News senior national political reporter Sahil Kapur, Danielle Pletka, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and former Maryland Democratic Congresswoman Donna Edwards. She is also an NBC News political analyst. Thanks to all of you for being here. Sahil, set the table for us on this. Was this moment inevitable? Nikki Haley obviously eyeing her own political future.
Yeah, I don't think it should surprise anyone. Nikki Haley has been back and forth on Trump. I don't think anyone should be shocked that she ended up going back. She's clearly conflicted on him. We could see that going all the way back to 2016 when she endorsed Marco Rubio at the time. But when push comes to shove, she ends up supporting him. And whether that's part of, thinking about her own political future or something else going on, I think it is very notable because what message is she sending to those hundreds of thousands of voters who showed up after the primaries over for Donald Trump and still keep showing up to support Nikki Haley? Clearly, they don't think he's acceptable. This is her kind of telling them, yeah, he is.
Well, that's the key question, Danny. What happens to all of those supporters who make up not an insignificant slice of voters in these primaries? What message is she sending to them? And do you think they will be swayed?
So I think it's important to note that she said, I will be voting for him. She also said, I think he needs to reach out to people who are voting for me. She didn't say to the people who had voted for her, you should do the same, which was pretty interesting. And he should do the same. They've made very, very little effort in the RNC or Trump personally to reach out to Haley voters. And there are hundreds of thousands of them. On the other side, Donald Trump has been the Republican Party's nominee now for 3 presidential cycles. The notion that the Republican Party is somehow headed in a different direction is one that's hard to argue. And so for her, I think this is an acceptance of reality.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Donna, it's interesting. When I talk to Democratic sources, they say this race will be determined by Nikki Haley's supporters, that it's all going to come down to those critical voters. The Biden campaign did make an early attempt to reach out to them. But as Danny's saying, look, Trump hasn't done a whole lot to reach out to them. Do you think that the Biden campaign has done enough?
Well, look, Trump didn't reach out to Nikki Haley to bring her in, and there's no reason to think that he's going to reach out to Haley voters. I think the Biden campaign continues to reach out to those voters because they know, and especially because they're somewhat independent, that those are going to be deciding voters in these battleground states. And so I think you will see more of that overt outreach. I mean, you've already seen some digital and other ads where it is a direct play at the Haley voters. Biden's not going to miss that opportunity.
Not only has he not reached out, he has insulted her repeatedly with these schoolyard taunts and this disparaging nickname. And this is how Trump maintains control of the party. He has not walked any of his comments back, but the vast majority of Republicans who want to have a future in the party end up embracing him because that's the one loyalty test.
Do you think he changes course? Do you think he starts to make more of an effort to reach out to those voters? And I guess I'm also curious for your thoughts on Nikki Haley's political future. Is there an authenticity factor here?
So the one thing I'll say about Donald Trump is that he is, I think the nice word is mercurial. He goes back and forth, and he can decide that he likes somebody despite everything that he has disliked in the past, and he turns on a dime. I've seen this personally with some very, very close friends where he's, I hate you, you're a loser, you know, Fox News should fire you, and then turns around a week later and it's like, you seem to be the best guy ever. And so I don't rule it out. I don't rule it out. Authenticity, look, you know, at the end of the day, Republicans are looking for somebody who's going to lead the country. This isn't an ad for shampoo or supplements. We want somebody with reasonable leadership skills, reasonable vision, who isn't the Democrat.
Well, I think it's always hard to, as a candidate, to project what's going to happen in 4 years. And so if this was a political calculation on the part of Nikki Haley, there's a lot of time between now and 2028, and you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that is for sure. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about Justice Samuel Alito. He's obviously gotten a lot of attention at his home here in the area. He was, I guess he said his wife hung an American flag upside down in the days after January 6th, what was largely seen as a symbol of Stop the Steal. He said, look, this was my wife. I had nothing to do with this. But the New York Times just reporting that outside his beach house, apparently there is another political symbol. You see it right there. This is a symbol that is referred to as the Appeal to Heaven flag that has roots in some religious right circles. Sahil, what do you make of this, and what are the implications of this?
Well, Justice Alito got a lot of criticism on Capitol Hill, mostly from Democrats, about that upside-down flag. He's never quite explained why he flew it upside down. That did echo some symbols that we saw on January 6th. But I should also add that it's not necessarily a widespread symbol of Stop the Steal. There were some incidents there. Nevertheless, Democrats say he should explain it. His impartiality is questioned by this. And at the very least, they say he should recuse himself from cases involving Donald Trump and January 6th and election. Some are even calling him a MAGA justice. On the Republican side, there's a lot milder of a response. There are some Republicans like Lindsey Graham even who have been critical of Justice Alito. Graham said it's not good judgment that whatever happened in that altercation between his wife and the neighbor, he is still a Supreme Court justice and should be better. And Senator Mitt Romney was also critical. However, Republicans have no such appetite for an investigation the way Democrats do. So not clear where this goes from here.
Yeah, I mean, Danny, it was interesting to hear both Senator Lindsey Graham and Mitt Romney agree on this point. Poor judgment. But to Sahil's point, they're stopping short of saying he should recuse himself from any of the cases swirling around former President Donald Trump.
This is nothing other than a ridiculous jihad by the New York Times to try to affect the Supreme Court when it's in session. Sorry. I'm betting I'm the only person at this table who's voted Republican. I won't ask all of you, but the notion that that is some sort of a widespread symbol is rubbish. Second, men do not get to tell their wives what to do, even when they're Supreme Court justices. Her neighbor called her, I think we can say, the C word because they were anti-Trump and they thought that was appropriate. And she responded, I wouldn't do that, but I also understand. By the way, this happened after Trump had stopped disputing the election. As for this other flag, you mean the flag that George Washington flew? You know, come on. I mean, these allegations are without merit. There are real things happening in this country. The New York Times would do well to cover those.
Donna, I'll give the floor to you. Your reaction, and what do you make of this argument that it's an overreaction to the flags that
Here's
have
the
been flown?
thing. I went back and reread the updated code of conduct that the Supreme Court put out. I think Samuel Alito has violated each of the 5 canons that are in that code of conduct. And I think if the court can't police itself, Justice Roberts has said that he wants to, that they run the risk that their approval will plummet even more than it is. And whether you can argue and debate about that flag, but the fact is there shouldn't be any political statements coming from a Supreme Court justice.
Danny, what about that? Just the idea, taking the flags out of it for a minute. What about that argument that should a Supreme Court justice be allowed to brandish any type of political symbolism, and should there be some policing of that by the Supreme Court itself or by Congress?
You know, the notion that the United States flag is some kind of political symbolism, that flying the flag that George Washington flew during the Revolutionary War is some sort of political symbolism, is really, it is really a reflection of the descent of our political debate into ridiculousness. You know, you can disagree with Supreme Court justices, you can dislike them. I've disliked plenty over the years, but I don't go after nitpicking this way.
Look, if you're going to have a code of conduct for the Supreme Court, as you do for other courts, then somebody has to enforce that. And if the court is not going to enforce it, then I think Congress has to step in.
Should the code of conduct really go to an argument that someone's wife is having with their neighbor, in which the neighbor cast the most heinous aspersions on her character and on her husband?
He's not just any person. When you're in politics, when you're in the public light, those things happen. His job as a Supreme Court justice is to step back from it.
I don't think anyone's saying that should be forbidden. I don't think the argument is that...
I think that's exactly what's being said here.
What lawmakers in Congress, what the Democrats are arguing is that there should be a binding code of conduct that requires people to recuse if there's a conflict of interest or an appearance of a conflict of interest, and there should be disclosure rules when it comes to gifts and that sort of thing.
You can't disclose that's something that's not real. That's the problem.
Yeah,
that's the issue.
I'm not getting into that in this situation. Right. I'm telling you what is and isn't on the table. No one is saying that a justice should not be allowed to brandish a certain symbol. That's not what's being discussed.
And to your point, at this very point in time, it doesn't appear as though there's enough momentum to actually take any broader action.
That's on the table in the 2024 election. If Democrats sweep, they might try it.
All right.
Good luck with that.
Great conversation. Fiery, robust conversation. Thank you, Sahil Kapur, Danielle Pletka, Donna Edwards. Thank you so much. And coming up, newly unsealed documents reveal new evidence of obstruction by former President Donald Trump in his classified documents case. Former Trump administration attorney Ty Cobb joins me to break it all down. You are watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. We've got more now from our focus group of double haters in Arizona, and an issue that has both campaigns pretty worried, third-party candidates. The 12 panelists from our focus group were asked who they supported in a two-way race. President Biden had a 5-3 lead over former President Donald Trump, and 4 people said they wouldn't vote if Biden and Trump were their only options. But when given 5 candidate choices, independent candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. got 5 votes, and Green Party candidate Jill Stein got 2 votes. Biden got 2, and Trump got 1. And when they were asked about Kennedy, a couple of our panelists who said they would vote for him admitted they didn't have a ton of knowledge about what he stands for. Take a listen to this part of the conversation.
I picked him because I know he would be good for the economy, because I know he's involved in stocks and then crypto. And I don't know if he was an environmental or he does something, I don't know, with the environment. So I think he's just hopefully help with the economy and environment.
Well, I know that he is one. So for me, it's really just past history. A family history for him, basically what his uncle did for our country. I haven't really looked up his policies, but based on who we have, I would lean towards him with a little bit more research.
Joining me now on set are 2 of the journalists involved in these Decide Our Focus groups, NBC's Yamiche Alcindor and Margaret Talev, director of the Syracuse University Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship. Thanks so much to both of you for being here. I mean, these are among the most fascinating conversations. Yamiche, what were your key takeaways, particularly as it relates to what you heard from these voters about RFK Jr.?
I think this group really overall underscored that for this segment of the population that really isn't excited, they really have negative views on both President Biden and former President Trump. You had some of them calling former President Trump a liar, saying that he was racist, saying that he was someone who was cruel and harsh. But then on the other side, you had people saying President Biden looks weak. He makes the whole country look weak. They talked about his age. They talked about the fact that they didn't agree with his policies. So that was really interesting. And, you know, you ran down the numbers there when it came to RFK Jr. The first group, because we watched these for 3 hours back to back. The first group, I was struck by the fact when it became a 5-way race, just in that first group, neither of the people in the group said that they would vote for President Biden or former President Trump. So it was really interesting that they literally got 0 votes from either one of these parties. It was also important to note that they had strong views on other things like abortion and the border. But it really, I think, again, just underscores that they're just not excited about this supposed and likely rematch.
And, you know, Kristen, if RFK were able to convince these voters and other voters between now and November that he were a consensus candidate, a centrist candidate, a moderate, a good alternative to Biden and Trump if you're trying to split the difference, someone who would harness the Kennedy family legacy, and he were able to keep his actual policies and beliefs and stances at bay, he would be a serious threat to both of these candidates, but they don't know anything about his policies on abortion, on vaccinations, really on anything. And most of them admitted they hadn't done their homework yet. They were looking for someone else. They liked the idea of him, but they needed to do more work before they really knew where they stood.
What did it tell you? I mean, you heard, to your point, you heard one of the voters say, hopefully he can do something about the economy.
These are kind of Hail Mary voters.
These are double haters.
They are double haters.
What's fueling them, and when do you get the sense that they will engage more deeply, Margaret, at some point?
You know, that's a really good question. It is May. Most of these voters in both of the panels that we spent time with are not deeply consuming 2024 election news every night. Will they between now and November? A lot of them are getting their news from social media, or they're getting their news from local news or, you know, networks. But when asked about social media, they're all going to TikTok or Instagram or talking to their friends or whatever to get their impressions of these people. So they have superficial knowledge and a real distaste for the status quo. And they're either thinking, I might as well just stay home, or they're looking for something else. Anything else. They think that Biden can't get stuff done. They think that Trump can get stuff done, but many of them are so turned off by the drama and the chaos and the personal politics that he brings.
Yamiche, when you think about, and you've listened to a lot of these focus groups now, and you've listened to a lot of double haters, do you think there is enough time to sway them? Because obviously the concern, if you're the Biden camp and the Trump camp, is not just that they vote for RFK Jr., that's part of it, but that they're going to sit this one out.
My sense is that some of these people, I almost want to say a minority of them, are persuadable because some of them have such strong views. Because, again, it's a rematch. They already saw 4 years of Trump. They've already seen 3.5 years of Biden. So they have really entrenched views both on their policies, though sometimes they didn't really know a lot about their policies, frankly, but also on just sort of the image of who they are. A lot of this, I think, is image. It's just sort of what they think of Biden, what they think of Trump. When you dug in and said, okay, well, what policy don't you like in particular? There weren't a lot of them that were pointing to a whole long list of things that they didn't like about President Biden or, frankly, President Trump. Even when it comes to the border, it's like, yeah, I didn't like the wall, but they weren't talking about sort of specific things that had been passed. But I also think it underscores that in a close race, which of course is what's going to happen with this rematch, that if you can persuade 2 or 3 of these people, that really could be the deciding factor in a place as close as Arizona. So I think they are persuadable. I think both campaigns really need to do a lot of work to make sure that people sort of change their views of them if they don't like them. And also, I think a lot of this is also beating up the other guy, frankly. Even though, you know, both parties want to say, I'm focusing on my guy, I think Donald Trump is beating up on Biden for a reason here.
Margaret, quick final point from you.
Abortion politics, fascinating in this discussion. I encourage everyone to go online and watch it. Even conservative voters really struggling with the idea that perhaps their own daughters could be punished if that were a choice they needed to make one day. It's really, really worth a watch. It was we were up late. We couldn't look away.
I was going to say these were voters in Arizona, so I know you guys were up late, and we appreciate it because this was fantastic and incredibly revealing. So thank you both for being here. Appreciate it, Yamiche and Margaret. Coming up after the break, former White House attorney Ty Cobb joins me for the very latest on former President Trump's legal challenges. Do stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome Welcome back. We've seen developments in 2 of the criminal cases against Donald Trump this week. Yesterday, Walt Nauta, one of his 2 co-defendants in his federal classified documents case, was in court for a pair of motions to dismiss the charges against all 3 defendants. In court filings unsealed ahead of those hearings, we learned of additional evidence prosecutors have against both former President Trump and Mr. Nauta, including these photos that appear to show Nauta moving boxes, one of which is marked classified, from a storage room at Mar-a-Lago in June of 2022. Now, also revealed allegations Mr. Trump intentionally shielded the movement of the documents from cameras at his estate. All of this comes ahead of next week's closing arguments in Donald Trump's hush money trial in New York. Testimony, of course, wrapped up this week on Tuesday. I'm joined now by Ty Cobb, who served as a White House attorney during the Trump administration. Ty, thanks for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Kristen.
Well, it's great to have you as always. So what jumped out at you this week after learning about the unsealed filings?
I thought the unsealed filings were actually very telling. It's unusual that President Trump was the mover to have these unsealed because they're completely damning to him, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 sentences. One question asked in the grand jury of Trump's attorney, Tim Parlator, apparently offended him, and as a result, he asked to have the whole 87-page opinion of Judge Howell unsealed. That 87-page opinion is 86.9 pages of excruciating detail into the crime and the crimes committed by Trump in connection with the classified documents, and proves them beyond any doubt at all. In a very easy to understand way, which perhaps Judge Cannon should read so she can actually understand some of this case. Well, her persistent delay is just inexcusable and unimaginable to other judges.
Well, so you're not buying her argument that there are various hearings and issues that need to be worked through before this can go to trial?
Oh, no. I mean, they should have had opening statements in this case this week, not motions 5 and 6, as opposed to out of several, a dozen or more that are still pending. In fact, neither of the 2 motions heard yesterday would have been heard by 95% of the judges in America, because they would have ruled on the pleadings themselves, as they're both frivolous. And the other judges, with the exception of Judge Powell, would have had an opinion ready to go, or made a decision at the conclusion of the hearing. She just is, intellectually incapable of making a decision, and she kicks the can down the road every time. These are not difficult issues. I mean, the issues in the 87-page opinion by Judge Howell, very difficult issues, and she crunched through them with detailed citations and analysis in a matter of weeks.
So let me ask you, because the special counsel is saying it has evidence to back up its allegations of new evidence of attempted obstruction by former President Trump. What kind of evidence would they need to have to show this? And how damning, Ty, are those pictures of Walt Nauta moving the boxes?
Very damning. Now, we did know earlier that there were tapes of videotapes of Walt Nauta and others moving boxes. So I suspect those are screenshots from those tapes. But yes, that's about as damning as it gets, because keep in mind that just before that date was when the Trump became familiar with the fact that there was an outstanding subpoena, and invited Evan Corcoran down to go through the documents. And before Corcoran arrived, had Nauta and others moved the documents, keeping his own lawyer in the dark.
Let me turn to the hush money trial in New York. Of course, we are anticipating closing arguments this week. It comes after Michael Cohen, the key really to the prosecution's entire case, had a bit of a roller coaster ride of testimony this past week. What will you be watching for in closing arguments, and who has the bigger burden, the prosecution or the defense?
Prosecution has an enormous burden, although I'm not sure the judge in his instructions is actually going to make them bear the full burden. It seems that the prosecution and the judge have concluded that all they want to do is get this case to the jury in some form or fashion. The reality is the legal structure that the jury should follow to try to tie the alleged felony to the alleged misdemeanors is not going to be spelled out for him. The level of intent required to demonstrate that Trump did commit the alleged felony in addition to the alleged misdemeanors is not going to be imposed upon the jurors. So I think, notwithstanding the fact they have the burden, the reality is I don't think the legal standard for that burden is going to be set out in a way that taxes them. And I think the prosecution has concluded that they would just soon get the conviction and let the appellate court sort it out. And the judge appears to be inclined to let him do that.
Okay, well, we'll be watching closing arguments closely, and we'll have you back to give us your fantastic analysis. Ty Cobb, always great to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you, Chris, and good luck and best of health to you and the family.
Thank you, Ty. I appreciate that so much. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.